Now I'm going to start this off with a quick video clip from last weekend's Star Wars Celebration, a clip taken from the Look Back at Obi-Wan Kenobi series panel, where the young Leia actress, that being 10-year-old Vivian Lyra Blair, is talking about a scene from the series I'm pretty sure we'll all remember, the one where Kenobi was trying to sneak her out of Fortress Inquisitorius by simply hiding her under his trench coat.
I remember the scene where I was in the coat. I was inside the Imperial officer's coat, and I kept poking my head out to look around at the set, and he kept trying to push me back in. And it was really funny. I kept just saying how is anyone believing that this random lump inside this guy's coat is just normal? How is this happening?
And you just gotta admire the honesty and, well, kind of ignorance of youth sometimes, which I don't say in any sort of mean-spirited way towards her. She's just calling it as she sees it, and actually being very Leia-like in the process. I may not have liked the idea of young Leia teaming up with Obi-Wan in the series, but I've never had an issue with the young actress they picked. Anyway, what made this humorous is, I don't think she's exactly aware of the fact that not only were we, the audience, wondering that too while watching the scene, that how could this even remotely be working right now, but she's kinda unwittingly calling out just how utterly ridiculous that scene was right in front of those who thought it up and brought it to life or put it to screen. The child is calling out the adults in the room for something that was, well, it was stupid because, come on, would Obi-Wan really think that was going to work? Would he really think nobody would notice? Though yeah, I have seen some try to defend that scene by saying pretty much that very thing, that nobody would notice because it's so obvious that none of the Imperials would think anyone would be dumb enough to try it. Or they'd be so distracted by what was going on they wouldn't notice, even though what was going on, what was distracting them, was somebody trying to escape from the base, one of them being a child, which, I don't know, you'd almost think would make them a little more aware of what was going on around them. Others still have tried to defend this scene by simply saying that Star Wars has always been silly and dumb fun, and this aligns with that. They'll say it as if goofiness is a defining characteristic of the franchise, and thus it's okay or an okay excuse for any number of, let's call them poorly written moments, like this aforementioned attempted getaway scene in Kenobi. And though I can't and won't deny that in its long history there has, for better or worse, certainly been some intentional goofiness in Star Wars, with Jar Jar Binks in Episode 1 easily being the best or worst example of this. But I certainly don't think that, for one, it's always been a part of Star Wars and is now or should be some sort of set-in-stone trait that can and should be used to, again, justify poor writing. I mean, if we go back to the very first Star Wars film, there's nothing really outright silly in it, or any purely silly moments. It may or does have an overall fun feel or vibe to it, but even that is somewhat debatable when you consider some of the rather dark things we see in it, including Luke's aunt and uncle being burned alive and the destruction of an entire planet, which brings about the death of millions upon millions of people. Heck, even the destruction of the Death Star sees the death of hundreds of thousands. And the thing is, all these darker elements, the fact that Luke is motivated in large part by the murder of his aunt and uncle, is not something you want to undercut by outright silliness. You can add levity, absolutely, and there's some of that in that first film. I'd say the droids add a dose of that here and there, but especially in that first film, the droids really don't come off as anything I'd consider silly or goofy. In all reality, C-3PO, though eccentric, you could say, he's kind of a dick towards R2 in that first movie, more so than he usually is in the movies, I'd say.
I've just about had enough of you. Go that way. You'll be malfunctioning within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile. And don't let me catch you following me, begging for help, because you won't get it.
Then when it comes to the second Star Wars film, To the Empire Strikes Back, there's nothing silly about that movie, unless you want to count Yoda's little act to fool Luke when they first meet, where he's trying to test him. But that isn't the film being silly, that's a character in it using goofiness for a very important plot point. Then there's Return of the Jedi, and okay, you have the Ewoks, and they are certainly a bit silly, or the fact that they best the Emperor's best troops is a bit much. But other than that, and being cute, cuddly teddy bears, I don't know that they come off as completely silly, or that Lucas intended for them to feel that way. In fact, Lucas really wanted to make a point about a less advanced indigenous people defending their home against a mighty and more capable empire. But then we move on to The Phantom Menace, and for some odd reason, George Lucas fully embraces silliness and or goofiness with Jar Jar Binks. And the reason why I think this is an odd decision is not just because it feels like a big tone shift from the previous trilogy, but because Jar Jar was basically the first ever all CG or motion captured character to star in or be featured in a film, certainly of a film this size. The first attempt to make people believe that a digital character wasn't just a cartoon superimposed on the screen, but could be, or made to look like, they were actually there interacting with the characters. And for some odd reason, maybe because George Lucas had his doubts about the audience buying it, he decided to have the character feel like a cartoon, you could say. And I don't know why. I don't know why you make that decision, why you don't try to make it a serious character. Again, you're trying to sell this new technology, you're trying to convince people that character is actually there, and yet he sticks out like a sore thumb. Again, maybe he was afraid he wouldn't work, so he made him a little more silly. There's even that now famous clip, one that many think is him talking about Jar Jar becoming Darth Jar Jar, where he talks about his doubts, and you'll realize those doubts are just him concerned about if they can make Jar Jar work, or if he will be maybe too over-the-top humorous, or just maybe the technology won't work.
Jar Jar is a key to all this. If we get Jar Jar working, because he's a funnier character than we've ever had in any of the movies before.
And I really do think Jar Jar Binks and The Phantom Menace is where this belief comes from that Star Wars not only can be silly, but should be, that it is some sort of inherent trait. Even though the reaction to Jar Jar by the fandom and the media was so bad that Lucas decided to not only tone him down in the future movies, but to reduce his role. And though I'm not bothered, or wasn't back in the day, by Jar Jar as much as some fans were, I still would have preferred him toned down quite a bit. Which isn't to say that I don't think there's ever any place for outright silliness in Star Wars. I mean, there are silly people here on Earth, so of course there are going to be silly beings across the Star Wars galaxy. I'm just opposed to silliness at the wrong time and place, or when it's used as an excuse, usually by fans, to defend obvious poor writing, like trying to make me believe that Obi-Wan again not only would try to sneak Leia out under his trench coat, but that he'd get as far as he did. Because we're talking about Fortress Inquisitorius here. We're talking about one of the most secretive and secure facilities in the Empire, and the best writer or writers could come up with to get Kenobi out of there was that. Something that made the Empire look even more idiotic or incompetent than other scenes in the show or even in that episode already had. I mean, it's bad enough Rebels made the Empire look as foolish as it oftentimes did, but at least that was an animated show aimed at kids, where you're going to expect that from time to time, well, the bad guys are going to look pretty stupid. But in this case, we were talking about the Kenobi series. We were talking about a show that, at least in my opinion, should have been about as serious as Star Wars has ever been taken when you consider the characters and subject matter. So in closing, yes, Star Wars is meant to, for the most part, have fun or have a fun feeling to it. And it doesn't always have to take itself ultra seriously. It can get a little bit silly from time to time, and I think that's okay. But I really don't think it should be used as an excuse for obvious poor writing. Writing so bad that, and no offense to this young lady, she seems incredibly smart, but something so bad that a 10-year-old realized it and laughed about it. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about all this. Do you think Star Wars is inherently silly or meant to be? Or is it something that can have a bit of that within it, but shouldn't be described that way or used as an excuse for, again, blatantly obvious poor writing? Whatever you think, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.